Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I would like to spend the next, 45 minutes or so introducing you to a colleague of mine. Her name is Callan. She's an executive coach who is currently in-house at Public Health Management Corporation in the Philadelphia area. And I just want to spend some time today getting to know her a little bit and talking to her about all the wisdom that she has to share, specifically around coaching. So, Anne, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Great. Thanks, Brianne. So happy to be here with all of you. A little bit about me is that I have been coaching for just about a year, sort of as an evolution of my career in organizational development and professional development. I've been working at PHMC, which Brianne mentioned, for almost 12 years now. It's a large sort of social services, health services organization, doing a lot of work in communities locally and nationally. But my role has always kind of been in the office, in the central space, sort of looking outward at what our employees have needed to do their jobs really well. So over time, that's meant strategic planning, it's meant change management initiatives, different employee engagement activities, but primarily in this training, learning, and development space. And that work has really led me into a real interest in and passion for coaching, as it's really presented to me, for I think my capacity and my skills, the most high impact kind of work I can do to really develop somebody, to really help empower and eventually change the course of someone's career and eventually even life. And so I'm eager to talk a little bit more about coaching with you today. Before PHMC and before I got more into this development field, I've been at the education space, both retail education, the Princeton Review, the test prep company, and after that I was with the University of Chicago, so I was in more of a classic academic environment, and really am just sort of a liberal arts major at heart, a writer and a communicator, and I think that also has been a pretty important piece of the puzzle for me as I approach coaching. So that's who I am.
Awesome. So, you've talked, about coaching, and, we're going to spend some time today talking about coaching. So, coaching really is pretty on trend right now. How do you define coaching?
Yeah, it is on trend. You hear that language a lot, and I think it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, depending on their orientation, to what professional development looks like, depending on the culture of the organization they're in. You have life coaches, you have professional coaches, executive coaches, and, I think a lot of us grow up thinking a coach is often in like the sports field or fitness coaching, which is a pretty specific dynamic where the coach is telling the athlete what to do. And sometimes I think it's easy to talk about the coaching I do when you talk about what it's not. So it's not that kind of coaching where I'm telling someone what to do, which is kind of where I think people confuse advising or mentoring with coaching. An advisor or a mentor's job is really to, give advice and say, I've been there. Here's where I think you might go with this situation you're in. You might want to follow my advice. So that's kind of a different thing. Or training or consulting where somebody's got expertise or a context, a professional context or a set of experiences that really lend to sharing with an audience or an individual, and they're really kind of teaching, and they're saying, here's how this can be done, here are the best practices to get this done, and that's training or consulting, and again, not coaching. And even in the kind of coaching I do, and sometimes when you hear about life coaching, the lines can get a little bit blurred with even therapy, because sometimes the work can be emotional, and sometimes we explore what happened before to understand what's happening now. And so it's not therapy, spoiler alert, and that's kind of sometimes I think an easier way to sort of say what coaching is. And I do certainly have an affirmative position on what it is, which is basically the way I've been trained. It's really an inquiry-based model of engagement with an individual. And so the key word is inquiry. And I always say to people I'm coaching, I don't have the answers. You have the answers. I'm not doing this work. You're doing this work. I'm a safe space. I'm a navigator. And more than anything, I'm going to be somebody who can ask you powerful questions to get you to look inward. And together we'll commit to forward motion on the goals as you define them. And part of the work with coaching is often just getting to that place of defining goals, and that can take sometimes 2 or 3 sessions. But again, it's always sort of this space of I'm following you, the individual, where you want to go, and my technique will stay the same, which is inquiry. If I have an observation I want to make, or if I have an assumption that I want to share, or if I want to reflect back something I'm hearing, I'll say, I have an observation, or I'm making an assumption, can I share it with you? And, that's how I put maybe my personal stamp onto the interaction, but largely it's the work of the individual, and I'm just kind of following them there.
So you talked a little bit about, in the session. So what does a session look like?
Yeah, so I usually do 1-hour sessions, but they've been known to go 2 or 2.5 hours, depending on kind of, the time we have, of course, or really what's going on with the individual. But I start every session. The first session is the very, very first time that I'm talking to someone. Sometimes is really just a chemistry meeting, and you'll hear people talking about the importance of chemistry if you start doing research into coaching, because it's a pretty important dynamic, and there's no hard and fast truth there, but that first session sometimes is not really a classic session at all, and it's just sort of a get to know you, tell me what you might want to accomplish in this session, and we sort of get to know each other a bit, and afterward there is sort of a space for an individual to say, you know what, I don't know that coaching is the best work for us to do together, and perhaps that person would go and look for a different coach, or would decide after that conversation, actually coaching isn't what I'm looking for, I do need a mentor, or I really should look at a consultant for the work I'm trying to do with my organization. But that aside, that first session aside, to get into sort of the real dynamic, the first thing I say after the pleasantries, of course, but the first thing I always say to someone I'm sitting with is, how are you doing today? What's on your mind today? What's alive for you today? Because I'm trained with a particular emphasis on a term called Gestalt, which is sort of like the awareness of what is the here and now. And so we could spend, an hour talking about what's going on with that person today, the conversation they had with their boss 10 minutes before they walked into my office, or why they were up all night with one of their kids, or, whatever is real for them in that moment. We talk about it, and we, kind of get through it. If it's the kind of thing we can get through, or we stay there if it seems like an individual needs to stay there. And this is covered in the first session with the individual, what we're always doing in a broad way is working toward really what I call kind of like the North Star of the engagement, right? So I try to do at least 6 sessions with an individual, and over those 6 sessions, I try to continuously point back to a North Star as we've tried to define it in the first or second session. And again, it can take a couple of sessions, up to even 3, to even define that. But once you have enough of an in-depth conversation with somebody, even one time, you do just start to get the energy of where they're going. We can meander a bit. We can touch on, again, whatever topics are present for them in that moment, but it's my job to keep us on focus of what are the broader objectives of this engagement. Why did you source a coach in the first place? And what is our forward motion for growth here? that you would want to be able to understand and demonstrate after having worked with me. And so a session can look like a lot of things, and because it's specific to the individual I'm working with and because I'm following them there, every session goes wherever that individual takes it. So there is no sort of usual, except that I'm always kind of in a space of inquiry and just trying to kind of provide a safe, agnostic, non-judgmental dynamic so that folks can share and really get through to what it is they're trying to get through.
Hold on 1 second. The kids came in my office. Hold on 1 second. Oh, sorry about that. My nephew lives with us, and he's supposed to be watching them, and apparently he left.
Wait, who lives with you?
Yeah, he's living with us because things have... No, my nephew.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so.
Well, that's, those sounds are very familiar to me. I know those sounds so well.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just go into the next question, I think. Okay. So, why is everyone talking about coaching? Why is it so valuable?
Yeah. So I think coaching's kind of evolved at this sort of major value proposition over the last, say, 20 years. Like 30, 40 years, nobody was really talking about it. And the last, I would say, 20 years, it's much more sort of welcome in business environments. And it originally really was considered truly for executives, I think, at least in my research. Often, your classic coaching client was that talented CEO who was problematic in some way. So we need this person at the top, but he or she just has this Achilles heel that's getting in the way of performance management, or, has an interpersonal dynamic that they're really struggling with and is impacting performance. Now it's much less about correcting the broken behavior and more about elevating strengths. And I think that there being like a problem or a challenge is not the necessary prerequisite that there was before. So I know in my work, I actually say, this is, I'm looking for folks that do not need corrective interventions or, dramatic behavior change. I'm looking for the high potential folks that we want to retain and empower, and I want to just kind of help them get to the next level as they define it. So I think sometimes coaching is thought of as like, this is your last chance before the chopping block. And I think that's a picture that's evolved quite a bit. So why it's so valuable is really about sort of enhancing an understanding of self, enhancing an understanding of situations folks find themselves involved in. It's really kind of a space and a time set aside like no other, where somebody can safely, with an unemotional party, that being me, the coach, can really examine challenges and issues, or they can just really work on getting themselves to the next level, sort of aside from any particular challenge or issue. but it's the heightened awareness and the clarity of what might be feeding impediments to their growth or challenges that they're facing in their current situation that I think really yields true transformation. So awareness, clarity, those are kind of like my promises to folks. I promise stronger emotional intelligence and higher levels of empathy after working with me. We talk a lot about, like, what are the consequences of you not changing? Let's look at it from all sides. And, you know, when you think about the value of coaching and you talk about a more sophisticated level of decision making and you put it in the setting of, like, a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, you know, that person making a better decision or making a better hire or knowing their strengths better or knowing their weaknesses better can actually be the, you know, can actually equal like millions and millions of dollars of either revenue or, you know, of risk management averted, I should say risk averted. You know, so it's like, it really helps people just be centered and make the best decisions they can make. I don't promise advancement. I don't promise the degree of change one can expect. Those things are out of my control and really defined and activated by the individual. But I do promise awareness of self, awareness of the situation the person is in, forward motions on the objectives as the person has described them, and higher emotional intelligence, higher levels of empathy, and really kind of that clarity.
So, you know, you refer to yourself as an executive coach. Does that mean that, you know, you only coach executives, or, you know, like, what is the ideal person for a coaching situation? Can anyone benefit, or is it really, you know, the type that you do is really just for executives?
Yeah, well, I think short answer, absolutely anyone can benefit. You know, the ideal candidate is often, I often think about the ideal candidate pretty simply as someone who's really committed and truly desires to learn and to grow. You could say, you know, the better they know themselves or the better they communicate or the higher status they have or the more people they impact, the better to kind of be the most valuable. But the truth is a good coach should be able to draw out high impact, you know, regardless of what that individual's specific details of their specific situation is. So my methodology is absolutely agnostic of status. But I use the term executive coach for a couple of reasons. One, I think today in business, in the industry I'm in and across industries, it's a term that people understand, and it does separate out some of the different types of coaching that you hear about. And it happens to also be the level of work that I'm doing at PHMC right now. So actually in-house at PHMC, I use the term management coach a little bit more often because my focus is on director level talent who really impact the quality of the work in our field, who are on the ground in the sense that they're doing programs that are impacting communities, but they're not day-to-day in the field, so they still are leading and managing and have a scope of strategic responsibility that I think is kind of like a perfect space for us to be having them look inward and having them think about their own potential and capacity to do more, to be better, and to continue to grow.
So what would you say is the most valuable, or what is valuable about coaching?
So the way I've been trained and the way I do this work, it really is about clarity and awareness. That's sort of like the premise that you can't get around. It's like the It's sort of the keystone of the work. But it goes hand in hand with forward motion. So the reason that we look inward and the reason that we pressure test ideas and challenge ourselves to look at how we've been handling things, challenge ourselves to look at how an individual has been working with their team or a particular interpersonal dynamic. We sort of look at all sides and ask them to explore, like, hey, if you were that person, how would they be experiencing this interaction with you? We do all of that exploring and like digging so that we have real clarity and purpose and confidence about what is the forward motion that we're kind of driving toward. And so that's always the North Star I kind of mentioned earlier is what kind of represents that forward motion. And when we get into sessions, we're talking about goals and objectives. And at the beginning of every session, I don't think I said this before, there's always the how are you and what are we doing in this moment, but it's right after that is, and what are we accomplishing today? And it's the work of the individual to name the objective for that session. Often it's aligned with the broader North Star. Sometimes it's not exactly. And again, it's my job to kind of make them integrate and to keep navigating the conversation toward what are those objectives so that growth and forward motion can actually occur.
Cool. So when you're coaching someone, what type of tools do you use?
So you've heard me say a couple times, like inquiry is my kind of key tool. And often if we're kind of getting through a particular situation or challenge or somebody brings up like a kind of a clear impediment that they're trying to break through, inquiry works really well because it continues to sort of challenge the individual to, look at it from all sides and really increases their clarity on what's going on. But sometimes I say that there's kind of two buckets of work we do in coaching, and one is that, like I just sort of named, we have a challenge, we have an issue, let's get through it, let's figure it out and move forward. But there's also that other bucket, which I've also kind of mentioned, which doesn't rely on a, quote, problem. It's just like, hey, you're talented, let's increase your capacity and let's bring you to the next level. And inquiry certainly works well with that too. And in the two buckets, the lines blur quite a bit. They overlap. I mean, all of this work is extremely fluid. You can imagine these are conversations, and as I said, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're really practical. But there has to be an elegant sort of chemistry that just sort of keeps the whole conversation going, regardless of what exactly it is we're working on, what exactly the objective is in that moment. So this is all very fluid. But often with sort of the latter bucket, where there is no, quote, problem, we also, have tools that we use. So there's strengths and a personality assessment. A lot of people know Myers-Briggs. A lot of people have taken that one. There's one called Hogan that I really like, or even like there's the question of what do you want to be when you grow up, even if you're 50. And I think about tools like what color is your parachute, where you're just really understanding yourself a little better and breaking yourself out of the mode of everyday work, and this is my job, and this is my identity, and this is what I do, and this is what I'm good at, and this is what I'm not good at, and it kind of like sort of pops that bubble and makes you sort of in as much of a blank slate as we can sort of hope for, sort of re-examine that. I also like to do different exercises. Describe the ideal life you want to have in 5 years. What does that look like at home? What does that look like at work? What kind of leader do you want to be? Break it down for me. Like, how would that leader address, an individual who has a challenge? How would that leader address a team just for a regular weekly meeting? Like, let's get really specific about what it looks like when you think about your own ideologies of who you want to be. And then we go like sort of step by step. How would we get there? What would be your impediments to getting there? But there's real power in having someone name what they hope to aspire to be, what they currently aspire to be. And again, like it's that naming and identifying and being aware so that we can then say, yep, we have confidence that this is the work we want to be doing. And then it's almost like the objective and the forward motion to get there is a little bit easier because we've done that dirty work of digging through the noise. There are other exercises. Sometimes I've used like imagery, like pictures, like laminated pictures, put them in front of someone who might be stuck with what it is they're trying to accomplish, or even they forget, like, why did I even get into coaching in the first place? Like, I'm fine. Like, I'm not sure how I want to grow. You know, I think that's common. We have complex lives, and people can be sort of stagnant in their growth one week, and then the next week they're flying high. Or we have paralysis by analysis, and we just don't know where to go with it. So sometimes if that happens, I'll put pictures in front of someone and say, just what resonates with you? Like, this is a picture of a horse, and this is a picture of a girl in a field, and this is a picture of the ocean. And, you know, it can feel a little fluffy, but, and it's certainly not like a classic tool, but it's just being creative with folks, and, you know, getting to know them so that you can sort of think, like, this tool might work, or this tool really probably won't work. But just sort of like, why does this speak to you? Tell me more. Why? Just kind of getting at different angles of how people feel about themselves and their situations. And, yeah, God, the exercises are sort of endless if you want to go there.
Yeah, yeah. So I know that you can't, you know, obviously because of confidentiality and everything, you probably can't tell us, you know, too much. But do you have any examples of what you've done, you know, how you've helped people, like changes you've seen in people through coaching?
Yeah. I just wrapped with a woman a couple weeks ago who is, I was going to say, approaching mid-career. She works in sort of a central support department for, you know, this large organization where she's accountable to all of the programs in this organization and responsible for a particular body of work that really impacts the quality and sort of the compliance picture for these programs. And because it's a complex organization and because she isn't 20 years seasoned and is still kind of figuring out her own strengths, I think she often would get easily overwhelmed. She is very principled. She had very high standards for herself, for the kind of work she wanted to do, for how much she could kind of go home that day and say she accomplished, right? Like she had been previously in a sales environment, which was more quota-driven, a little bit easier, I think, to see her achievements because it was numeric. And in the environment she's in now, it's not at all. It's very subjective, sort of, and sometimes hard to quantify the work you're doing because sometimes it's political or sometimes the changes that she was implementing were more seeds being planted that didn't yield those quality or compliance improvements that she was going for until like 6 or 12 months later. So being very sort of high performing, high productivity, but also struggling a bit with like knowing what her professional identity was because she's just hasn't been in the field for that long. It created a lot of like angst. And so what we did was really kind of talked about what is success for you in this job. And oftentimes throughout those sessions, we would go back to that question again and again. Let's talk again about like what is success for you and what's going to make you feel good at the end of the day, and having her name a realistic picture of success. And so there was some like sort of reframing that she had to do about what achievement really looked like in this environment. And sometimes that looked like, or sometimes we got there through emotional intelligence and empathy, because there was, I think, a need for her to kind of broaden her lens on the competing priorities that people were bringing to the picture, people that she relied on for, sort of achieving certain things. And she was more doing the laser focus thing that maybe worked for her a little better in, that sales environment that she was more comfortable with or that she was with before. And so it was a reframe and a naming and identifying of the situation she was in, the context she was working within, really sort of understanding the priorities around her so that she could say, oh, I get it. Like, I'm in a totally different environment than I was before. Here's what success can look like. These small measures are actually big measures. And so by the time we finished, she had like a renewed sense of morale about the work she was doing, because it wasn't going to yield like grand achievement sort of objectives, which she was used to. It was more about smaller objectives or different types of objectives, and again, it was that naming of them where she was sort of like really confident about her work, and she also got to know herself better through all the inquiry. I would challenge her on like, she would say, I've always been really good at this. And I would say, how do you know that? How do you know you've always been good at that? Like, who has validated that in you? Past managers? Or she would say, I've never been good at that, and I'd say, well, how do you know that? So just a lot of kind of, it's that digging and that exploring that eventually yields just really deeper understandings of self and of the situation.
So, you're a coach. How do you develop yourself? Do you use a coach?
I do. Yeah, I have a coach. I have a coach that my coach lives on the West Coast, and so we talk by phone. And he's, does for me what I try to do for other people, which is ask me questions about what it is I'm trying to do in my life, in my work, and then we talk a lot about goals and how to get to the places I'm trying to get to. And I find it really helpful. Sometimes I talk about coaching, sometimes I don't, and it's all personal. But, I've always, and I say this to everyone I work with, the personal is professional, professional is personal. We're not robots. It doesn't mean you have to, quote, bring work home with you, but who you show up as at work, at least I would say ideally, is really who you are in life, right? And if you are kind of wearing different hats, why are you doing that? And would it be more comfortable to try to blend the two and find a job where you can be totally yourself? But yeah, so I do use a coach, and I think it's wonderful. I developed myself in a few ways. My favorite way, very of the times, but I'm kind of a junkie for podcasts. And in the spirit of the professional being personal, like I find that when I'm listening to podcasts that are just really speak to my interests, what I enjoy, even if it's not, quote, classically professional, I do think it enhances who I am professionally. My favorite podcast is called The Beautiful Writers Podcast with Linda Severson, and she's a writer, she's a publisher, she interviews thinkers and writers that I really love, and I just love hearing how she interviews them, and I love hearing kind of the wisdom that comes out of those conversations. But on a more kind of directly professional side, there's a bunch of podcasts I love. There's one called Boss Files with Poppy Harlow. She talks about CEOs with CEOs and about their journey, and it kind of reminds you that we're all just normal people. There's How I Built This, which is kind of interviews folks who were really entrepreneurs and built companies really from scratch, and those stories are always so incredible and always fun to kind of catch when something started as almost a whimsical idea or something that didn't feel like it could be a true business, and then hearing how that evolved into a beautiful business, and it really inspires me. There's also the Work Life podcast, which is by Adam Grant, who's an industrial psychologist. He's actually based in Philadelphia at the Wharton School. The podcast is done, I think maybe it's sponsored by TED, as in TED Talks. But he just covers so many topics that I really care about when we're talking about management and leadership. He talks about emotional intelligence, he talks about psychological safety, trust, creativity, relationships, advancement, constructive criticism, all these kind of interesting dynamics at work that really yield strong leadership. And he does really interesting interviews with interesting people. I just heard one a couple weeks ago with Trevor Noah, who is the star of The Daily Show, and how he runs his writer's room and how he approaches really leadership. So those are some of the podcasts I love. There's also there's a great website, cornferry.com is the Korn Ferry website. But the Korn Ferry Institute is a link there on their website, and that's really sort of just a lot of resources and literature that, speak to management consulting. They absorbed the Hay Group, which was a management consultant group out of Philadelphia. Just in the past few years, those two organizations have merged, and it's just a really strong force of knowledge, wisdom, data, a lot of interesting management and leadership, and just work-life knowledge. And I like looking at all that stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do a lot of the same kind of things, just listening to podcasts, getting different ideas, and I just feel like for me it helps me be creative in different ways, because it's like my brain is engaged in things that I'm passionate about. So that's great to hear that I'm not the only one. So we're getting to the end of our time. If someone is interested in coaching or being a coach, or anything related to coaching, what would you recommend they do to take their first steps, I guess?
Yeah, so a great place to go first is the International Coach Federation, that website, either icf.org or .com, I think. That's the certifying body where I have my coaching certification. It's really the premier body for really those standards that kind of qualify the profession. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of information about just how to become a coach, information about why you would want to use a coach. It's a really good kind of home base on coaching. I think also it's an interesting thing to sort of talk to friends and coworkers and managers about coaching. Like, what are their perspectives? Because it is a newer concept in the last, say, few decades, it's always interesting to talk to people about what they understand about it and maybe experiences they've had with it. Sort of like we're all evolving together in this field, and I think those conversations would probably be really useful.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for spending time with us today. Everyone who's listening, if you have questions for Anne, go ahead and post them down below, and she will get back to you and respond to your questions. But thanks again, Anne, and we look forward to speaking to you further.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.